cardio.
If you could get a higher peak and a little bit more curve before you plateau, you would definitely see an improvement on the wall.
Hey y'all, welcome back to the Struggle Climbing Show. It's me, Ryan Devlin. I am your weekend warrior host, just an average guy, trying to get better in the scant time that I have between all of life's craziness, extra crazy right now because it's summer vacation and the kids are home from school, to just get better and enjoy rock climbing as much as I can, progress, and now in my mid-40s, try to do the hardest things I've ever done. And today's conversation with Dr. Tyler Nelson really zeroes in on an area that I'm trying to put more focus on right now, in that you, especially if you're a route climber or perhaps a boulderer who wants to do a lot of boulders in a session or some longer boulders, probably want to pay attention to as well, and that is critical force. Now, if you're not sure exactly what critical force is, that's fine, because neither am I. In fact, I tested my critical force before connecting with Tyler on this conversation here, not even really knowing what the heck it was. But he explains it in this conversation, and as is, typical for Tyler, this is, I don't know, what is it, his like fourth or fifth time on the show here, he really, really brings the science. And in fact, in this one, we jump like so quickly into the topic and the science that we kind of skip over some of the basics. So allow me for a second here to just indulge myself with a bit of an overview for myself and for you, if it's helpful, to really understand critical force and the components that go into it. So critical force is a test that is done for climbing, and it's a pretty uncomfortable test because it's basically trying to fully exhaust the reserves in the muscles that make anaerobic moves. So kind of whatever that is, and Tyler, I'm not gonna go too deep into this because Tyler will talk about it. But basically, when we make really hard moves, we're not using our aerobic system, we're using our anaerobic system, and those reserves in our muscles, like the ATP there, is finite. But then, as moves get easier, or when we do easier moves, those are more aerobic, okay? So those are more kind of fueled by the aerobic system, which as blood flow goes around and we're just bringing oxygen into the body, we can essentially do for a very long time, and maybe in theory forever. And so critical force essentially is this test that you can do a few different ways, and Tyler talks through ways that you can use a force gauge to use it, which is what I did, but there's also ways of doing it just like with a hangboard. And it basically exhausts all of the power sources in the muscles in the forearm flexor bundle, and then gets you to what your plateau would be, essentially what your aerobic threshold is, where you could just kind of make moves forever. And then a graph comes from that, and it kind of looks like a slope, right? So it's like kind of starts high on the left side of the axis, and then it drops off, in a bit of a kind of a downhill slope, and then it starts to level off. And how high it starts is based on how strong you are. And so Tyler in this talks about MVC, which is your maximum voluntary contraction. And basically what that means is just like your max strength, like how strong are your fingers. So that could be your max hang or your max overcoming isometric, or basically just, how we always kind of talk about finger strength and testing our finger strength. That's what it is, right? So I tested that, and basically the first couple of pulls that you have doing this critical force test is going to be up near your maximum hang or your maximum pull, depending on how you're testing yourself. And then it drops off. And so how quickly it drops off is going to kind of determine how much power endurance you have. And then where it levels off or where it plateaus is going to determine kind of your aerobic threshold, if you will. And so we'll get into this in more detail here in this conversation, but I think that's probably a fair enough jumping off point to understand that critical force is this combination of how strong you are and how aerobically fit you are, as well as how anaerobically fit you are. So it tests your kind of, in a sense, your max strength, your power endurance, and your endurance all in one test. And the results of that, like the shape of the graph and the values of what are revealed on those graphs, can really point some big neon arrows to where you might want to focus your training. And that was my big takeaway from this one, because even as I came into this conversation with Tyler, I had no idea really what I was testing. When he took a look at the results, he drew some very clear conclusions for me on where he felt I could put a lot of my focus for my training as a route climber for the next few months here. And spoiler alert, it's not what I was thinking. Like it's actually quite a bit different than I was planning to do, but very complementary to what I'm currently planning to do. So I'll talk a little bit more about that on the back side of this. And by the way, when you're listening to this, as this episode is out, I will be on my way to Australia to visit my sister's family who live outside of Melbourne. I'm going to meet up with past guest Dusty Millar to do a little climbing out in the Grampians. I'm so excited. So I'll post some pictures, but I'm actually going to try to unplug quite a bit if I can while I'm in Australia with family. I'm going to be taking at least a week off, maybe 2 weeks, I don't know, from the podcast. But I'll do a plog. I'll put a plog out from Australia, just kind of a casual update on what's going on with me in the trip. That's something I can record pretty quickly, and it'll be fun to do, and I'll just do it from like the backyard of the Airbnb. But then maybe I'll do like a re-release of a favorite episode or something, so we don't just have like a dead week of air. I'll dip into the back catalog and maybe bring out something that feels especially fun or cool or timely or relevant or something like that. So stay tuned for that. But thank you for allowing me a bit of a vacation here. My first time to Australia. I'm very, very excited. And it's crisp. It's like winter conditions over there. It's hot and muggy here in Kentucky, and it's crisp and probably a little bit wet down in the Grampians. But I'm just going to be so excited to get on rock and check out some really cool and historic routes out there. So yeah, that's my little mini update. I'll give you a bigger update on the backside here after you hear this conversation with Tyler about critical force. You guys all know Dr. Tyler Nelson. He is the principal behind C4HP, or Camp for Human Performance. He works closely with some other coaches that are fantastic and have been on this show, Colin McGee and Jesse Firestone. And he just is such a nerd about the science of climbing and testing and running experiments on himself and his clients and reading all the papers that come out and citing those. And so this dive here into critical force, while a little bit geeky, or maybe a lot of it geeky, I think can be incredibly useful and enlightening, especially for busy climbers like probably you and me, who really want to understand where we can move the needle the most. And that was my big takeaway from this conversation here. And the good news is it doesn't even take a whole lot of work to do this critical force test, or even to program some training interventions to then help to boost whatever it is that you are looking to improve as a result of what you learned from this test. So yeah, let's get into it right now with Dr. Tyler Nelson. You did a post not too long ago about critical force, and I tested my critical force, not even understanding what it is. I tested it the other day just so we had something to talk about a little bit with this conversation here. But maybe that's a good jumping off point, which is for you to tell us even what critical force is and how it applies to climbing.
How did you test it? That's one of the important talking points. I think that's not been described in the literature yet, but things that definitely I think are really important for the actual outcome of the test. So how did you test it?
So I used my ForceBoard force gauge, and there's a critical force test that's on there, and I did single hand. So I did my right hand and then separately from my left hand. And they were, if I recall, they were 7-3 repeaters, pulling as hard as you can. Basically, every effort was a max effort.
Yep.
And it went for a certain amount of time, and I don't remember how long, but I remember that it was hell. I mean, it probably was like 4 or 5 minutes or something.
Yeah, it's the paper that was published by Dave Giles. It was 4 minutes. So
okay.
Like I've done those repeaters way back when the G strength was still like a thing, and we had like this crazy tool where you had to put the cords in to turn it on. It was very cool looking. Looked like a little explosive device. But like it's a 7-3 times 25 rep repeater at max effort. So it's approximately 4 minutes in length. Got
it. Yeah, it was the first time I'd ever done that. I had tested endurance in the past using, it was on Lattice. It was a Lattice, I don't know if they called it the lactate curve, or maybe it was just an endurance repeaters, but it was something like I took I think it was maybe 40 or 50% of my max hang. And so I was removing weight with a pulley and doing similarly, I think it was repeaters, 7-3 repeaters, if I recall, or maybe 6-2 or something like that for time. I don't have those results in front of me, but that was like then for total time. So you would basically do 7-3 repeaters at a percentage of max hang and then until failure. And then it recorded total time under tension or how many reps you did.
Yep. So the traditional method where they did the critical force was you would do repeaters at 80% of MVC, then you would do repeaters at 60% of MVC, and then you would do repeaters at 45% of MVC, and you would do those to failure. And that was the original method proposed and done to, create this curve where you try and understand your energy system utilization. But the downside of that test and why they kind of moved away from that is it takes a long time. Takes like a couple different, you do it on different days or you do it at different times during the day. So it just like extends the time. So its ability to be done as a field test becomes a little bit more challenging for people that just want like to try and get a better sense of, what the number looked like. And what was your critical force? What did it estimate?
So I've got the results here, and then we are going to have to go backwards and actually define what critical force is. But I'll continue down this line of thought. So for my right hand, it said critical force is 55 pounds, and for my left hand, critical force is 47 pounds. And but I don't know what that means.
I'm gonna pull up a sheet. Let me just so I can have this. So left hand was 47.
Left was 47, and right was 55.
Right, it was 55. And so what's your MVC? So what's
that's my max?
Yeah, what's your max force number?
So let me pull that up. I did that not too long ago. 20 millimeter peak force, left hand 133 pounds, right hand 135 pounds. Now that wasn't for a certain amount of time. That was just like I ripped it as hard as I could, not for like 5 seconds or 7 seconds. It was just like what was the absolute top of the chart, basically.
Yeah, so if we do critical force divided by your peak, that's 35%. So on the left hand, your critical force is 35% of your MVC. And then on the right hand, it is going to be a little bit higher. Yeah, so 40% on your right hand. So essentially you could say, and the hypothesized outcome of a critical force test on your left hand means that you should be able to sustain 35% of your peak force indefinitely. So if you were on a route that required no more than 35% of your max force, you should be able to send that route without getting pumped and losing energy. And on the right hand, it would be a little bit higher. And so like and there's not good standardized numbers in the literature, but I've done tons of this testing, and Lattice has done tons of this testing, and JedRes from Strength Climbing has done a lot of testing, and like the recreational climbing percentages that we see are like 30 to 40% MVC critical force. Elite bouldering athletes is like 35 to 45%, and then elite route climbers is like 40 to 50% of their MVC as their critical force.
Got it.
So it's like
so just so I'm
having that
understanding,
number inch up is important, but the reason it is important to talk about your MVC is your MVC is still the most important metric for climbing.
And that's just your pure finger strength.
Yeah, your peak force that you can generate. Because if your peak force is much higher, right, then the percentage, if the hold requires the same amount of force per individuals, but if your peak force is higher, that's a lower percentage of that peak force. And so if your critical force is not that much different, you're probably still better off sustaining that intensity indefinitely.
Okay, so then just if I'm dumbing it down correctly for myself, critical force is an equation that has to do with what your peak force is in relation to what this critical force kind of outcome. I guess maybe I'm already mislabeling.
People could envision a curve, right? You just have a y-axis and an x-axis, and imagine doing 7-3 repeaters. And so they'll see these small horizontal lines, and those horizontal lines will be going down as the test continues, right? And so with that test, you'll never hit your peak force on the first repeater. It's very unlikely that you will. You'll get pretty close. So you don't want to use the critical force test as the peak force test.
Right.
Measure peak force by itself. But the first rep will be the highest, and then indefinitely they will go down, and then they will plateau. And so that plateau is attempted to identify a intensity that's sustainable long term.
Okay. So when I'm doing that by minute 2 of 4 or 3 of 4, certainly, I've basically used up all of my power. And so the only thing my body is able to generate is what it will be able to generate indefinitely.
Yeah, that's the metabolic explanation. So they use the term W prime, which is things above your critical force are going to be largely anaerobic in nature by their metabolic expenditure. The things at the very top are going to be phosphocreatine, the 10-second effort time frame. And then the things until you get to your critical force are going to be glycolytic. So they're going to be the anaerobic lactic system. And then when you hit your plateau, that's things that you should be able to continually supply with the aerobic respiratory system. So you should be able to, because you're not going to run out of that energy system when you're climbing, right? So it's trying to define those thresholds so people can target their training more precisely.
Got it. So for me, using my right hand here, it said 55 pounds was my critical force. Does that mean that if I was lifting a 55-pound object off the ground with a 20 millimeter half crimp like I was doing for the test, I should be able to do 55 forever? Or is that's a number that then has to be put into an equation of a relationship with my max force, which gives me the percentage that you gave me?
The original thought is you should be able to do that indefinitely. But that's where the method of testing it really matters, because the original paper that Dave Giles did, I forget the exact year, maybe 2021, but they measured quite a few climbers and they found their critical force, but they didn't actually do a validation study. So a validation study would be like, okay, this is your critical force. Can you really sustain that force indefinitely? And so Ballas, who's another researcher, did a validation study on measuring critical force like that, and they realized that overestimated someone's critical force. So that was the critical force that was estimated via that test was not sustainable long term, because the papers that they use to get these ideas from come from cycling, and they would do like 12-minute, 20-minute tests to define someone's critical power, and that's brutal. Like even doing it for 4 minutes is not a pleasant experience. So doing it for 12 minutes, 20 minutes on the finger flexors is like, it's definitely intense. I don't know if there's any risk there compared to other sports like cycling, but that's what you have to do to really define if it really is sustainable, right? And so the Ballas paper showed that it overestimated it by a percentage, and my thought process there is that it's the way the test is done. So I don't do the test in the way that they originally did, which is why I asked about. So did you do it seated or standing?
Standing, like as if I was trying to rip it off of the ground, like the force board was anchored into the board on the ground, and I was just pulling up as hard as I could. Okay.
So like the original methodology of doing it, they used the digital rung, the lattice digital rung, and they had the legs staggered, so one foot in front of the other, arms straight overhead, and they had them lower into it with as much force as they can. So which is a yielding style isometric. So they can leverage their body weight and leverage a lot of passive structures in that body positioning, where when I do the test, I have people do it as an overcoming isometric. And I've had a lot of people do this over the years. Like years ago, we did a podcast on my Patreon account and a bunch of examples, and people doing it that way, then they can sustain it long term. So I think the biggest differentiator there is the method of doing the test, because it's not as muscular as other muscular tests, if that makes sense to people listening.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this gets back to, and you and I have had conversation on it that I'll link in here in case you all haven't had it, but we've talked a lot about the yielding style versus the overcoming isometric style. And so the overcoming isometric style does not rely on the connective tissue, or at least not nearly as much. It's more of a muscle contraction. And so you're saying with the critical force test, you were finding a way to test people where you remove the urge to use your, like for me, I was doing like rips, I was using my
Yeah,
it was
you push with
yielding
your legs,
style.
for sure.
Yeah, I was pushing with my legs and just basically trying to keep my fingers from opening and doing that at a max power every single rep. You were somehow locking their elbow out or something like that, so they would just curl into the edge. They couldn't pull with their shoulder or their arm.
Yeah, and you can do that overhead seated, but it just requires some education of the athlete. So they, because climbers are all very similar. We want to get the highest number. We want to put them as much force. Like we don't have a problem putting that 110% in. But
Right.
if the intention is to measure the muscle and the muscle's fatigue resistance, I want to measure the muscle as best I can. So I want to like do it in a style that's going to make it more fatigued. And one interesting caveat is like the citation that the Giles paper used because there was a critical force test and framework created off of a paper in the upper extremity where they measured critical power in the forearms. And so that's the primary impetus and citation for, hey, this makes sense for climbing. But that paper used a hand grip dynamometer. So a hand grip dynamometer is absolutely an overcoming isometric. They're just squeezing that thing for, I think it was like 8 seconds, 2 seconds rest for like 12 minutes or something. But that in my opinion, is a very muscular test. You can't really cheat that test by loading more connective tissue. And so I think that got applied to climbing and make it look like climbing, which is more hanging. But I think that kind of overestimated those numbers. That's my hypothesis.
Yeah, that's interesting.
As to why it didn't work.
It seems like the dynamometer would be the better way to do it if you're truly just trying to isolate the forearm flexors. But obviously, as we climb, we're using shoulders and lats and a million things. And so is critical force, as kind of we're talking about it right now, which is essentially our ability to climb aerobically, to climb kind of indefinitely without getting pumped, is that limited truly? Is the limiter the forearm flexors, or would there be some shoulders or anything else that would come into play?
I mean, I think those definitely matter, but I rarely hear of climbers failing because their shoulder gets tired. It's almost always the finger flexors. So, I mean, in some cases, sure. And I think the testing positions kind of differentiate that, where you doing it from the ground doesn't rely on your shoulder as much. So I would probably say doing a critical force test overhead probably makes more sense because it replicates the position with the arm overhead, but it also makes the oxygen availability reduced because gravity is constantly pulling down, where other critical power tests, like in cycling, your heart is constantly pumping blood to the muscle, where in climbing, it's like really hard to pump uphill, for a climbing test. So I typically have people do it overhead to some degree, but it's a grueling test for sure. But I think it's pretty interesting. I think it's really helpful, and I think it does have like an important place in climbing. We just don't really, it needs to be understood specifically to the athlete though. And so we have to look at an athlete's training history, what their goals are. Are they primarily sport climbing or bouldering? What does their MVC look like? How sharp does the curve drop? Does it plateau early? So we can get, like, I've done enough of these that when I do clinics and I teach and we do some critical force testing, it's really easy to see someone's graph and be like, oh yeah, I'll bet you're really good at this style or you do this. And it can be pretty spot on when you get used to measuring those. So for having athletes learn how to do it with the Tindeck or the force board is really insightful for them. It's just not fun to do.
Just making a broad generalization here. Maybe I'm oversimplifying, but is this metric mostly applicable to route climbers? Because we're talking about how long can you climb forever, which usually isn't a limiter on a boulder, right?
I mean, I don't think it's totally off the table for bouldering athletes. I would say for high-level bouldering athletes, it probably makes more sense. Certainly not like recreational. I like to boulder for fun. I don't have really big training goals. I would say no, they don't need to do the critical force test. But for someone that is like going on a trip, or they have a really long season, or a professional athlete, I think it just helps define, like, it can be a recovery metric too. And it can be just like, because like a very high level bouldering athlete, they would have a really high MVC, and their like ability to sustain that MVC would drop pretty quickly. But conversely, someone that's like let's say a female sport climber that only sports climb, they would have a low MVC, they would have not a sharp drop, and they would be able to sustain that. So you can, even if they don't want to repeat a critical force test, you can see that, and they usually know what they need to work on, but it's a really good visual to be like, okay, your force is really low, but your sustainability is really high. You don't need more sustainability, you need more force and power. Where the bouldering athlete, they're obviously strong and powerful. They don't need more strength and power. They need more capacity building work because they need more repetitions. They need more practice time, right? Instead of just ripping a couple hard moves and falling.
Right. Yeah. In which case it wouldn't go off such a sharp cliff that they would be able to sustain it at a more gradual decline. This episode is supported by Arc'teryx, and I'm going to be out in Squamish, BC again this August, just as I was last year, for the Arc'teryx Academy. And I'm telling you, if you haven't been out for an academy, if you have a chance to get out for an academy, I could not recommend it more. I just had the best time last year out there. Arc'teryx does it right. They bring in their entire athlete team. So basically like every superstar climber is just walking around the streets of Squamish. They put on clinics. They have incredible film premieres and programming for a few nights. This year, the Academy is taking place August 21st through 23rd in Squamish. I'm going to be hosting some of the programming. I'm really excited about that. I'm going to be doing a couple live happy hour podcasts with friend of the show, Chris Kalous from the Enormocast. So Chris and I are going to be teaming up, doing a couple live podcasts, a bunch of giveaways, and then just hanging out and climbing and taking part in all of the incredible programming that Arc'teryx puts on. And if you haven't been out to Squamish, it's just got it all. It's got world-class bouldering, single-pitch sport, trad, and then, of course, multi-pitch there on the Chief. I did a little bit of everything last year, and I'm going to do a little bit more of everything this year, and I would love to see you there. You can learn all about it over at arcteryxacademy.com. I'll see you in Squamish. I want to come back to the variety of different ways that listeners right now could test, whether they have a force gauge or just some weights or pulleys or whatever. And let's come back to that because I want to at least make sure that I'm understanding, and by extension, the listener, what the value is for understanding critical force, just in the first place. So we can use me as an example. You crunched my numbers there. I think you said 35% on my left hand and 40% on my right hand or thereabouts. What does knowing that tell me? And what do I do with that?
How much do you weigh right now?
155.
Okay, so
probably 158. Let's be honest.
Okay. I just did 155. So like your strength to weight ratio with two arms is 1.6. And so like you're 85% each hand. So that's actually pretty good. Like do you feel like your fingers are strong right now?
Really? Yeah. I just came off of a bouldering block.
Oh,
so
yeah, cool.
That's the strongest I've ever been.
And was the critical force test done recently?
Yes.
Yeah. So I would say that's pretty good. So like, and I can't really see the graph. How many reps did you do before it hit critical force? Did it do like 15 reps, 20 reps? Question. The actual looking at the graph is quite helpful for people when they do this. And I'm not sure what the force board graph printout looks like. I'm sure it's as visually appealing as the Tindex.
I mean, I don't know if that's showing.
That's pretty good. So I would assume that for you, like working on peak force is still a priority, right? Even though your peak force is going up, that's still going to be a metric that you want to boost up because the drop of yours is not that great, but the sustainability plateau is pretty significantly long, right? So you want...
Okay, so just for the listener, by the way, and I will put the video up here so people can watch this, but for the listener, my graph looks like it was pretty quickly, it dropped down, but then it just leveled off. Like I did like a handful of what were like pretty hard rips, it looks like, over 100 pounds, and then it dropped down and undulated a little bit, but basically kind of settled around like where it was going, if that makes sense to the listener.
Yeah, so you want your anaerobic power to go up still, which makes sense.
So I would not have thought that because I was coming off of a bouldering block, so I'm those finger like max strength tests are the highest they've ever been, but I haven't done any endurance training because I'm a Red River Gorge climber. Like I just focused on bouldering like for the better part of 8 months. And so I would have thought, okay, Ryan, you've got strong fingers. Let's now start building up endurance. But you're saying continue to build the finger strength, and it should bring up the
continue
endurance.
to build anaerobic endurance, like, or anaerobic power for you, because the good thing about aerobic capacity is it doesn't really go away that fast. And because you're still doing strength and power stuff, you're still training that energy systems recovery, and you're probably doing other physical things. Maybe you run or maybe you cycle, and all those aerobic adaptations are still aerobic adaptations. Like those things are, you're still doing them to some degree in another context. You're not going to lose that at all. But unless you get like more hypertrophy or a little stronger in the forearm flexors and the fingers, you won't really change your ability to sustain more anaerobic, power for a longer time frame.
Okay, cool. Well, we'll come back to in a minute how one could, me and others who are listening, could do that, like through our training protocols. But where did my body weight come into to
just to see your strength to weight ratio for your fingers? So your two arm strength to weight ratio is around 1.7, 1.6, which is that's not bad at all. It's like that's in the advanced, based on like larger data sets, numbers in an advanced climbing category. So like advanced climbers, critical force, their peak force is around 140 to 180% strength to weight ratio with two arms, which is yours. And then critical force is within like 35 to 45%, which is yours. So you definitely fall into an advanced climber category based on, metrics that are out there. But we want the peak force to go up, and we want the critical force to go up.
Right. So we want both of them to go up. And for me, I mean, we'll just continue to tease it down my personal line right now, but then we'll broaden it out to other use cases. As I noted, my goal this fall is a route called Flower Power. Chris Martin, who you worked with, or maybe are still working with, Chris Martin, who's out here in Louisville. He was the first ascensionist of that route. Anyway, super pumpy. It's 13B, which would be the hardest route that I ever climbed. And so like it's steep, pumpy, but also bouldery. It's kind of like got everything, but it's 120 feet or thereabouts. So it's a much longer time climbing than I'm accustomed to, certainly coming off of my bouldering phase right now. And what do my current metrics suggest I would want to do in order to get to the fitness level or the recovery level or the strength level to do a route like that?
What's the time frame you're on that route? If let's say if you're not falling, what's the approximate send time?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's
minutes?
2 sections with a full sit down. So you climb a 12B that probably takes, 5 minutes or something like that, maybe not quite. And then a full sit down, recover as long as you want. And then probably another 5 or so minutes. I don't know. I haven't even been to the chains yet. When you really punch into the business, that's like the 13B part of it when you go into the roof.
And do people typically, is there like, I'm sure someone's made arbitrary rules as to like how long a sit down is to actually count it as a send. Do people do that? Or is it like just sit there for 30 minutes and then do the campfire?
Yeah, you could sit for 30 minutes. People do. People bring like sandwiches up there.
That's funny. I love that for climbing. That's great. But I'm sure someone's like got these arbitrary rules of you only get 33 minutes and 30 seconds before you climb, or it doesn't count. The way that I think people can think about like critical force testing is if they visualize that graph, you can maybe target different intensities for your training based on that graph. And so you could even do think about the original critical force test as like a training intervention. You could do 80% of your max for reps to failure. And that would be a pretty reasonable, like high intensity kind of power endurance, anaerobic training intervention. You could also do 60% of your max, 7-3 repeaters to failure. That would be another very targeted, like upper extremity finger flexor training intervention. And you could also do your critical force or slightly above your critical force as repeaters, as like more of an aerobic kind of training intervention, where you don't need to do that yet. You don't need to do more aerobic training interventions. You need to do the 80 and the 60% more so. And people could do that however they want. They could do it on a fingerboard. They could do it with a tension block. They could use a strain gauge. As long as they know what that number is, like that's one of the good utilities of the test, I think. And then they could even, if they do that training intervention, they could remake their critical force graph and see how accurate it is based on those other percentages doing repeaters to failure. The problem with the testing in climbers, and this has always been the case, and it probably always will be the case, is failure is hard to define when you're lowering into the edge, because unless you have a video there of the fingers and you're like when does failure happen at the fingers, because even if they open, you can still get a lot of force on them.
Right.
That's why I like the seated position where you kind of like lock everything in place, where you isolate the finger flexors. It's harder to cheat. So if it's an overcoming style isometric, you just can't add more force. The force just drops when you're tired.
Yeah, and that's certainly a benefit. I mean, what you're talking about there with the repeaters, you and I had a conversation probably a year ago, and I think you did one with Neely as well that I listened to, where it was essentially, I was identifying how many moves, this was when I was trying to climb my first 13A, how many moves are on the route, and then I was doing, I think I was 60% of my max overcoming isometric, and I was doing 6-2 repeaters in trying to hit that many moves. Or prior to identifying the number of moves, I would do them to failure. And because since I was using the force board, I could tell when I couldn't actually hit the line that I was going for. And then I'd rest a few minutes and do another set of those. And then over time, hopefully I was seeing those set counts or those rep counts go up. Maybe it was 20, then 18, then 15. And then after a few months, hopefully it was 30, then 22, and then 20 or something like that. And so I could tell that at the same load, I was able to do more of those reps. Is that a critical force exercise?
It's not necessarily. It's a max effort at a percentage capacity test. Like the critical force test requires you to make the graph, right, and actually see the ratio and where you actually plateau is.
Right.
But the things above that, the W prime stuff, is all good training intensity stuff. So it works well as a intensity identifier and also like the approximate repetitions that you should be able to do. Because if you did your same test, like yours drops off after maybe 4 reps and then it kind of plateaus, or 5 reps and it plateaus indefinitely, which means that you can't sustain 80% for very long, right? 3 reps at 80% is not that much.
Which suggests for me then, if I'm understanding, power endurance routes are going to be much harder for me than just pure endurance routes.
Of course. And that makes sense. If you're climbing at the red a lot, that makes sense that you've adapted to have long endurance capabilities, right? Because that's the majority of what you're doing. You're spending a lot of time on the wall. But if that also means if you're spending a lot of time on the wall, you already have that component of your physiology kind of primed or pretty close to its max. You don't need to spend a lot of time doing that off the wall. You need to work on things that are much more intense and try and increase that sustainability, because they should both, the bar and the graph should both move together. But if you could get a higher peak and a little bit longer, a little bit more curve before you plateau, you would definitely see an improvement on the wall.
And the climbing equivalent of this training, for somebody who's listening, they don't have a force gauge, would be if they're in my position where you want to work on that W prime, which is the slower drop off after my peak force, would just be power endurance climbing, right? So like doing like circuits of hard moves, I don't know, 20 hard moves or something like that, and then resting.
Yeah, I think so. But the difference between the thing where it gets challenging and maybe not as intentional with the climbing as the training is when you watch people do capacity training and they do a route 3 times in a row, they do it very efficiently and they get really smooth and they move through it quickly, but that actually reduces the force and reduces the time under tension on the finger flexors, because the goal is to get through the 4 routes or the 3 boulder problems in a row. And so it actually reduces the mechanical stress to the finger flexors. So it doesn't mean that that's not a good intervention. It just means that they'd probably see they definitely would see a more reproducible stimulus and probably a slightly better benefit if they did it in a more boring way on a fingerboard, or, like doing wall crawl style. I have a lot of my athletes do like 40 degree, and for you it would be like 40 degree tension board wall crawls to failure. Like that would be approximately the same thing. Like make a route on the tension board or the kilter board or the moon board if you're really strong, and like try and make the holds like hard for you, but like in that kind of 80% intensity range, and just crawl really slow until you can't do it anymore and set a timer and see how long it is. and then you could replicate that. So you want to keep the stimulus the same, because doing it on the wall with different boulder problems, it just modifies the stimulus a lot. And so from like a trackability and like a direct objective metric, it gets a little bit more challenging.
Yeah. So the cleanest way of doing it, or kind of the least amount of variables, would be like how I tested my critical force essentially, which is just hook something up to a strain gauge, set the target, curl into it on a 7/3 repeater until you just can no longer hit that target.
Yep.
And then rest and repeat. And that would be essentially, in this scenario, a power endurance or a W prime training day or training intervention. And if that's something that I want to work on, along with increasing my peak force as well, how often would you recommend I work on that compared to doing the more kind of aerobic type climbing, the sub-threshold critical force type stuff?
You could probably do it twice a week. You probably don't need to do a lot of sub-threshold climbing right now, like maybe once a week. But if you're doing other stuff, you're probably getting that stimulus. But you could even do the peak force training interventions prior to doing the 80% effort. We would call it strength endurance because it's not, but that was where the language just gets kind of confusing. Like it's not really that powerful, but it's intentionally high of an intensity. So we could call it, climbers like to call it power endurance. But you could do the strength training before and then do that after, and just do like 5 sets of that a couple times a week for 4 weeks. And you should see an adaptation where you can do 1 more rep, 3 more reps. Like you want to increase your ability to do more reps, and then you want to repeat tests and then make sure that you made the adaptations that you're looking for. If people didn't have like a strain gauge and they wanted to do it like in a fingerboarding style, what they would do is they would do a peak force for like 3 to 5 second hang test and a half crimp, and find the maximum load, right, that they can tolerate and sustain that grip position. That would be their peak force. They would take that number, find 80% of that number, and they would do reps to failure. Note how many reps that is. They would do 60% of that number, reps to failure, and then 40 or 45% of that number, how many reps to failure. And they can kind of define that curve, based on Excel or add those numbers in somewhere. And they can do a critical force test on themselves without a strain gauge. But the strain gauge is just much faster, obviously.
Do you happen to know, maybe it's just something that I can link in the show notes here, but like what is the equation? So I get, at 80% I get 15, and then at 60% I get 20, and at 45% I get 35 or whatever. So I've got these 3 numbers of reps that I was able to complete at these different loads. What do I do with those numbers?
So essentially the one that you can sustain indefinitely should estimate your critical force. So for most people, like it will be between 35 and 50% of their MVC will be their critical force. So it'll be somewhere in that range. There's even a different kind of newer endurance metric that's been talked about for climbing that just guesses the critical force based on those percentages. Because there's enough people that have done it, the critical force test, that it's not going to be 20%. It's not going to be 70% of your MVC. So you can kind of guesstimate it in there. Even if people wanted to take the easiest approach is like measure your MVC, estimate 35% of that, see if you can do repeaters over 4 minutes. And if you can, that's probably pretty close to your critical force.
Well, that's cool. That's a cool idea.
Technically, the best way to do the training stuff, we mentioned the 80% indefinitely, would be like doing it on a Treadwall, with like a timer that's like click, click, so you can actually get more contact strength and releasing and stuff. But I'm surprised that hasn't gotten more popular. I think the Treadwall makes a lot of sense. And I think when they try and get into climbing gyms, people just don't know how to use them in like an objective way. And so they're just not fun. So they kind of get thrown out and replaced and sold. But I'm really surprised that didn't catch on as like an important training tool, because it's definitely the best way to train endurance or to test it.
I found one on Marketplace that's sitting in pieces in my garage. So I'm going to have a Treadwall in my garage pretty soon here when I put it together, and I'm psyched.
Yeah, you should, for sure. That's great. So what you would do is you would, use the average hold size on that route you want to do. and you want to set that to the, the wall angle of that route. And then you want to understand how many hand moves you need to make before the sit down rest, how many hand moves you need to make after the sit down rest. And then you want to like track the total time on the wall and try and make the hand holds consistent just so you can reproduce the same stimulus instead of just like, because when you climb it, you're going to haul ass through it as best you can, which makes sense. But with the training, you don't want to do that because you want to keep it on your finger flexors the whole time. So you're getting a slightly greater stimulus the next training session, right? So you want to push the needle in that sense. But yeah, that's definitely the best way to do it.
Super interesting stuff. Okay, so now for the general listener, we're not going to know where they fall on this curve until they, test it themselves. Or to your point, maybe they don't want to test it and they don't have to. They can kind of just estimate that their critical force is going to be some percentage of their max. But the question then becomes, to improve this, if what we're trying to do is improve the ability to climb without fatigue. And so for route climbers, I'll just focus more specifically on route climbers, at least for this example here. We then, if a run to the chains for me at 12A is the absolute limit on what I could do by improving my critical force, or not my critical force, by improving raising whatever the threshold was that my critical force said it is, then maybe a chain run of 12B or 12C or 12D would then become within my kind of ability to do and recover on marginal holds and that kind of thing. But then I could improve that by either just getting a ton stronger. So if I could hang another 30 pounds or 50 pounds, on a 20 millimeter edge for like my max hang test, then every individual move is going to feel easier. Or I could improve that by getting better power endurance, or maybe by getting better aerobic endurance, right? So like what does any of this even tell us in terms of how we should train?
You definitely won't improve it with more aerobic endurance, because if you're like building more aerobic capacity for a low critical force is just going to allow you to do that longer. Okay. It doesn't actually increase the force output sustainability, right? That's why like peak force is still arguably the most important metric for climbing, because if I have a really high peak force and that's reproducible, or 80% of that is reproducible, every handhold that has a required force is a lower percentage of that, which means my critical force should be able to be sustained even longer, right? And so it like still kind of highlights why finger strength is so important, and having a high threshold for tolerance at that is still one of the probably the most important non-climbing, obviously then technical skills and stuff, climbing metric for athletes. And that's why the ratios always have to be looked at per individual and their training habits and their training history. And like I said at the beginning, it's pretty easy to identify what people's training is like just based on that graph alone. So I would suggest people like measure their critical force, see what it looks like, kind of look at the numbers, have their friends do it, think about the style of training that they normally do, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, and that will really help them look at it and make actionable decisions with it. Because people in your position, they want to do lots of aerobic training because it feels like more aerobic training is the answer, right? But your critical force would say, no, more aerobic training is not the answer. It's just going to allow you to sustain a lower percentage of your max for a longer period of time, which is not what you need to do. You need to be able to sustain a higher percent for longer, right? And so both of those numbers should change with peak force and with like a higher percent max kind of repeater protocol.
I mean, every time I talk to you, Tyler, I have to like rethink my entire training strategy, and in the best way. But like I was so convinced up until 45 minutes ago that what I needed to do for the next like 4 months was a lot of like just kind of more moderate climbing. Let's just get the mitochondrial development back in my forearms, because I took a season off of sport climbing for the most part, and I don't need my peak strength as high as when I was a boulderer anymore. Let's just get back into Red River Gorge shape. And now you're saying like basically not the opposite, but like, hey, actually focus more on power endurance. Usually I would wind up power endurance for maybe the last month before the season starts. Like that's when I would really kick that into gear, and I'd spend more like focus on aerobic endurance for the prior couple of months. But now it sounds like, hey, there's no reason not to start focusing on power endurance now.
No, you want to keep your strength and your power up. Like the power, I mean, if we're going to say power, like power is the thing that changes the most, especially for athletes our age. Like as we get older, power is the first component to slow down and go away, and it's the hardest to get back. And so strength is maintained pretty easily. Aerobic conditioning is maintained very easily. It's power that is the thing that can fluctuate, and so keeping that up is definitely a priority for athletes. But the training history says it all. You know, do you climb in the summer? Do you go to the red in the summer, or is it just too miserable?
Not as much. I mean, I still get out a little bit because I want to, or I'll take trips. Like I'm going to Squamish in August, and you know, but no, mostly it's indoor. Like I'll be on the Treadwall a lot, or at the gym on ropes there's a lead cave that I can climb in.
What brand is it? Is it the Treadwall brand? I think there's a couple of them, right, that have a movable.
Yeah, the one that I picked up that I will have in my garage is Treadwall brand, which is like, but it's an older one, so it only goes to 10 degrees overhung. And the project that I'm looking at is like 50 degrees. And so I'm already trying to figure out like, okay, how am I going to like shenanigans this thing on the same angle? But I do have a kilter board, a kilter full ride that's adjustable up to 60 degrees. And so while that's not as good as just being able to continuously climb like upward, I could do like circuits on that.
Oh yeah, that'll still work. You know, you just like, you know, want to use it in the same way, but you could probably find an engineer, someone that's creative, and just like put some additional supports for the Treadwall and just like crank it back harder. You know, I don't know how that would change the momentum.
I think
of the
that'll
spin
work.
and whatnot, but it probably would work. Probably
Yeah,
worth a try.
I don't think I probably couldn't go to like 50, but I think I could take it to 40 and have it still work, because Treadwalls are gravity. It's like hydraulics, so there's no motor in them, so it needs your body weight in order to
Down.
rotate. So the more you get it like horizontal, the less it would be able to rotate, you know?
You're just going to do a horizontal fingerboard repeater. It's like not moving at all. You just hang there.
Yeah, exactly.
Like little baby moves.
But how does this relate to climbs where there's active rest? So I obviously on this one that I've identified, there's a full sit down, but for other climbs at the red or just anywhere else that you go, rifle or anywhere, you know, you might get into a jug with a decent foot or a knee bar, but it's active. You still have to have your hands on. And is that where we get into aerobic training, or is it we're still kind of more anaerobic there?
I mean, it just really depends on the person. It really depends on the graph of the person, the peak force of the person. And like, so what I'm suggesting to you is not what everyone would do. Like if it was because for you, if it's like, if 13B is like a new hard grade for you and you feel like you lose power endurance, right? It feels like you get pumped and you can't do the power moves, but you have a rest in the middle of your route. You need to do a power endurance thing, rest. Because even though you don't feel fully recovered, you're still recovering. And then you need to do another power endurance thing. So for you, 80% is probably a pretty reasonable estimate to improve, and then try that and see how you feel on the wall. And if it's not, you know, if you feel like you're not getting enough reps there and you're not getting enough volume, then drop it a little bit. But if it was a continuous route, then working at 60% is probably a better target, because they don't need as much maximum effort level and they don't have that rest between it. Just is going to be more continuous. So they could do the same kind of training intervention, but the intervention on the wall, like we described, would be longer. Try and push it as long as they can.
Are they particularly unique or siloed? Like, does the 80% also help the 60% and vice versa? Or is it wise for climbers at certain times, either based on their goals or just in order to mix up training, to switch between how much load or effort they're putting in?
I think it matters. I think most people would do in that order, would do like peak force, generating phase, 80%. Because essentially that's what that's kind of what a 10-second max hang is. Like a 10-second max hang is not really someone's peak force number. It's probably like 90% of their peak force or 85% of their peak force, you know? And so like building that strength endurance base, so to speak, helps and adds to a 60% repeater kind of capacity training intervention. And then someone would go into like, you know, power mode where they're actually doing all their things on the wall and increasing the speed of the movements and the efficiency and all that kind of stuff. So I think 80 would help 60 more than 60 would help 80, of course, which kind of tracks with bouldering will help sport climbing more than sport climbing will help bouldering. You know, like you can come off a bouldering block and climb hard sport climbing, but it's really hard to do the opposite unless you're doing them both at the same time.
Well, I've certainly experienced that myself recently. If we're talking about training one of these, kind of zeroing in and saying, okay, I'm going to train this 80% kind of threshold, if you will, for a while, is there a recommended time period where it's like you're going to see really fast gains for X amount of weeks, but after that, you know, diminishing returns, switch it up? Or is it something that could just indefinitely be trained?
Again, depends on the goals of the athlete, the style of route they're trying to project. I mean, that works great for bouldering athletes. For bouldering athletes that have long routes they want to do, or they feel like their strength and power is high, but they can't sustain it long term, that 80% range is great. That's like a good do it, you know, as you get ready for your season, a couple months in advance intervention. For a sport climber, you would probably see it for 4 weeks, and then switch to like a 60% protocol and then push that as well, you know, for another 4 or 5 weeks leading up to a trip, you know, would work very well.
Okay.
But it's hard to say
so
when it'll plateau, but ultimately it'll plateau. And when it plateaus, you want to change the stimulus.
And so then is it helpful to do a critical force test? So I've got my baseline, if you will, coming off of my bouldering phase here. I'm going to tuck into a bunch of training, focus a lot on this 80% area like you've recommended. In how many months, a couple months, or, you know, indeterminate time, I retest it, and what do I do with that knowledge when I do?
I would retest it in like a month. Retest it in a month. Retest it in like 5 weeks. Yeah, retest it in 5 weeks. And if you do like a 80% protocol like we've been describing a couple times a week, maybe 5 sets of that a couple times a week in conjunction with all your other training, and retest it, you better see that your ability to sustain your, you know, phosphagen and your anaerobic lactic system should last longer before you drop and plateau. You know, we're not as worried about the plateau force for you, but I would expect that to also be a little bit higher, or it would be slower to get there. So being slower to get to your critical force identifies that your anaerobic capacity has increased.
Very cool. Okay.
And that's what you want your anaerobic capacity to increase, because your aerobic capacity right now is reasonable and not really a primary target. You know, it's not going to help you with power endurance things.
You know, one of the things though I notice, like when I go out to the red and I climb with people who are better than me, which is basically every single time I go out, is their ability to just kind of climb steady and recover on rests that seem marginal, and, you know, get good shakes, and just, it's kind of that Jonathan Searist, just sloth style. Yeah, let me just kind of slowly go up this route. Eric Hurst does that really well. And I guess without seeing any of their individual tests, what does that indicate? Like, where are they excelling, do you think, on that curve?
It's hard to say without looking at it, like you mentioned, but I would imagine John Segrist is pretty high to start, and it probably slowly drops, but then it stays pretty high. I'm sure his critical force is probably, I mean, it's definitely elite level. He's one of the best climbers. So I'm sure his critical force is 45, 50% of his MVC, and his MVC is probably like 1.8, I would imagine, 1.7, 1.8 with 2 arms. So it's like, that's what the metrics would say for elite climbing athletes is, you know, but he won't have high of an MVC as like Matt Foltz or someone that's primarily bouldering. Like, their MVC will be way higher, but their graph will plateau much faster and will plateau. His will decline slow and will plateau at a high percentage of his max. And that's also like a pacing thing too. That's also not over gripping on the wall. That's also putting more pressure through your feet thing. We want to attribute all that to physiology, which it does ultimately boil down to that, but it's more complicated than just like what your test looks like on your fingers. It's like they're just technically very good, right? And adapted to that style.
Well, yeah, I mean, a move could cost me 80% of my peak if I'm a sloppy climber, or it could cost me 30% of my peak if I know how to drop knee really well or heel hook or whatever. So it's, you know, we want to stop the energy leaks, but then also we want to have a bigger gas tank, I guess, at the end of the day in order to carry us through the moves that truly are hard for us. And I think what you're saying there makes sense for me in terms of what I understand I need to focus on. But then I guess the question becomes, when I retest my critical force in 5 weeks, and hopefully, to your point, I've seen those, not only all of the metrics go up, but that slower decline, which is what we're hoping, kind of that 80% range is what I'm going to be focusing on building. Do I then continue the course, test again, and if I don't see much change, that's the indication of when I maybe switch to the 60%?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. That makes sense. One of the things that I love citing is, I need to remember the author's name in the paper, but one of the climbing papers that used digital scales on the wall, they had elite climbers climb on it, sub-elite and elite climbers climb on it. The elite climbers had stronger fingers, but the elite climbers used less force per hand on the climbing wall. And so like that's really the target, and that's what people that are very technical and like to analyze technique and love the skill of climbing, which we all do, they tend to be like, testing doesn't matter because it's all technical and it's all fluid and flow state, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, you want both. Like you want your metrics to be clean and objective and repeatable. Therefore, they're kind of boring. We want those to go up, but we also, and just as important, more importantly, probably, is we want that technical, mastery. So people will have the ability to just sustain more efforts on the wall, right? So it's like important to make that distinction that with the testing we're describing, it's like, shouldn't replace your climbing, shouldn't replace your technical skills practice stuff, but it needs to be done because it actually will push your physiology, and it's easier to move those things and see those things change than it is like climbing technical skills. But elite athletes, they have both. They have elite physiology and elite testing, and they also have elite technical skills, right? Which is how people send the hardest things.
You know what I'm shocked by is when I talk to elite athletes, just in the last couple of weeks here, I talked with Adam Ondra and Noah Wheeler, but many others that I've talked to as well. And I ask them about their metrics. How often do you check in on your finger strength or any of this stuff? Almost all of them never test. They're just like, I guess, aware of what they need. Maybe it's more intuitive, or maybe the sport is young enough to a point where, we haven't gotten into the super science of it. I mean, I don't know. How does that strike you? Because obviously you work with a lot of athletes, but the majority of athletes are kind of amateur weekend warriors, and we're time strapped and we want to find ways to improve. And so I do a lot of testing. I just kind of want to know where I'm at and is what I'm doing working. But then you talk to a lot of climbers and they're like, well, I know I'm strong because when I grab a 6 mil on granite and I can kind of one arm it, then I know that I'm in a good spot. Like, it just seems so backwards.
I mean, I think if I was an elite athlete, I probably wouldn't care either. So it's like, if you're performing at the highest levels of the sport and you're being successful and you feel strong and you're ascending new things, like, I probably wouldn't pay a lot of attention to that either. That doesn't mean that it's not important. It doesn't mean it wouldn't be helpful to understand, but I think the buy-in is harder if you're an elite athlete because you've always been that skilled, right? Where, it's a mix of a lot of different things, training habits, individual mechanics and lever arm lengths and attachment points and pulley stiffness and like all these other factors that are trainable to some degree, but also largely genetic. If you have those things and you're naturally pretty gifted, it's like much harder. Like I talked to one of the German coaches last year at our course who trains the German team, and it's hard to get buy-in from pro athletes. It's like they like what they like and they're already excelling and they're being successful, and it's like really hard to convince them otherwise is probably why, but I can't blame them for doing that because it's more work and more stress for them, right? And maybe there's that psychological component of, I'm not going to test my fingers, I might look bad, or, I don't know. It's complicated.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good perspective to have. So, but for the rest of us kind of mere mortals who are trying to improve and find ways to not hack, that's not quite the right word, but just optimize, I guess, because we've got a billion other things that are pulling our time and our attention. We want to get the most out of, if I have an hour at the gym. And one of the things that I've been wanting to focus on more lately is, this is after having a conversation with Tyler Thompson, is having more quality goes in a session. So whether if I'm going out climbing outside or I'm at the gym, I can usually tell when it's going into like, I'm just kind of going off a cliff. Maybe I get 4 routes in and I'm like, I think that's my day, you guys. Whereas Tyler's like, yeah, but like, what if you got to the point where you had 5 good goes or 6 good goes or 7 good goes. And we use the word capacity for that, but I'm not sure where that falls kind of on the curve that you're just talking about. So rather than I want to do this hardest route that I'm doing, I want to do 6 routes in a session instead of 4 routes in a session. What's the training focus there?
I would say for most athletes, it's recovery. It's like just being able to recover between your sessions allows you to have more like ability to practice harder. I think that also is like a good argument for strength training, like non-climbing strength training is just a means of increasing total muscular tolerance and tendon tolerance, and strength training on your fingers just allows you more practice, of course. But then also you just have to have a training history of doing it. That's where training history and total time on the wall and training habits kind of add up. But there's also like a huge genetic component, like the International Sporting Committee papers would say the difference between elite and super elite is genetics. Like they just like can tolerate more mechanical stress on their tissues. They can recover faster. And so it seems like a lame cop out. No one wants to admit that and be like, no, they're just have better training routines and they're more dedicated. It's like the science would not agree with that necessarily. That doesn't mean that they don't have amazing grit and determination or dedicated. They do, but it's like they also have that little extra oomph to it as well. So it's hard to like say that this is the best way to get into that and to train into it so you can tolerate more reps. What I find most of the time is when people try and do that, they get injured or the quality actually goes down. So they would be better in some cases of splitting up their sessions per week. Instead of having 6 route sessions, they would have more 3 route sessions. Because if the goal is to send a route and not send a lot of routes, then having more quality sessions probably makes more sense than increasing the number of routes you could do in a session.
What does it take to increase the amount of routes that one could do in a session though? So like if I can only get to the gym 3 days a week and I want to be able to do 6 good routes instead of 4 good routes, is that aerobic endurance to help me recover for the 10 minutes that I'm taking a break between my goes? Or is it peak force so that each go feels easier?
It's a mix of all those things. It's definitely a recovery thing, but it definitely is because climbing is largely glycolytic, it's going to be recovery stress. Like when you get pumped, how long does it take you to recover? And depending on how pumped you get, I mean, that's like metabolic, like your capillary density, your ability to flush out hydrogen ions, and just like it's largely a blood flow thing, but it's also like an energy. A lot of people won't refuel halfway through a 6 route session, where like you probably need to eat because it's probably taking you 2.5, 3 hours. You definitely need to refuel midway through, and people tend to not do that. You want like immediate glucose in your system so you can recover faster and fuel your muscles. So that's one of the things that can help people sustain longer sessions is just refueling halfway through. But all of those things should be elevated together. It's hard to isolate one, but if your peak force goes up, maybe you don't get as massively pumped on the route, because the more pumped you get, the longer it takes to recover between those, sessions. So it's like peak force needs to go up, your aerobic ability to recover needs to go up. Like they all need to increase, but the easiest way for doing that, that's not, in my opinion, like a training target intervention. That's like doing more routes on average, doing more routes in your average training session. But then also, if you're going to do more routes than you're used to, you need more recovery days. So if you're going to go from 4 routes to 6 routes, you probably need 2 days off before you do that again. Because if you bump from 4 to 2 in a session and you keep your Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you're not going to recover from that. You'll be able to do it for a couple weeks, but that will slowly add fatigue. And then the reason for doing that goes away because the quality for every set or climb goes down.
Ooh, I've got a lot to think about here.
That's kind of a big jump, right? Like going from 4 routes to 2 routes if you're trying hard, that's a big jump in total volume per session and per week. So tracking that would mean that'll add up and catch up to you unless you space them apart.
That's another 50%. I mean, just 4 to 6, you're adding 50% onto it. But I should be able to. I mean, the more I have the ability to do that, the more fun I can have, because I get to go outside and climb more routes, and so that interests me. But so does training for this specific route. So if I'm going to focus on kind of the power endurance, for lack of a better term, for a while, that 80%, I'll test my critical force once I see that I'm not getting those gains like I was, hopefully between week 1 and week 5 and week 5 and week 10, who knows, then I'll switch to the 60%. And is it a similar protocol? It's still 7-3 repeaters until failure, and then I think you suggested 5 sets of those?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, that's a really easy to understand protocol, I think, for everybody who's listening. It's like, okay, the exercise, if you will, is the same. Just 7-3, overcoming isometric repeaters. I'm just curling into my force cage if you have one, or you set up a different system, and you just do it until you can't hit what your target is, and you take just like a few minutes and then do another set, repeat?
I would make sure you're fully recovered before you do another set. So 10 minutes, like depending on the fitness of the athlete. Like if I did a 60% repeater to failure, I would probably need to take 10 minutes off before I did it again. You would be able to do it faster. But you want to make sure that you're rested so the quality of every set is as high as possible.
Got it. So your repetitions for each of those sets should be around similar. The idea isn't to carry fatigue from one set to the next.
Yeah, that's the hope. But predictably, they will be a little bit lower than the previous one. So the goal is to like push. But the cool thing about that is it's very auto-regulated. So, the reps won't be the same. If you're not really warmed up, maybe the second set would be a little higher than the first set, but indefinitely they should be reducing. But the goal then is to give the tissues that stimulus, rest a few days, at least 2 days between, do that again, rest 2 days, do that again. And then they should see that the starting set and the second set should be slowly inching up and doing more repetitions. After, maybe 10 sessions or something, you got to give it some time to adapt.
Very cool. And then there's the 60% block, if you will. Is there anything after that, or then do you just go back to 80%?
Depends on, I would probably spin those up prior to a season or when you get closer to, starting to go do your project. And then I would probably drop it all together and just lean into projecting. Then I would keep measuring, then I would keep training peak force, but I wouldn't do a lot of capacity testing in season when you're going out, unless you can't get out frequently, of course. But then it's all about resting and recovering and going into the season. Did you climb with Jess this spring?
Jessica
Jenkins?
Yeah.
Man, I was so happy for her this year. I was so proud of her.
She did it. I was with her last year when she almost did it and then didn't do it, and it was pretty dark. And then I didn't get to climb with her this year. I climbed with Eric. He was out there, of course, caught her when she sent swing line. But yeah, she crushed. Were you guys working together?
It was so cool. I've trained her for years. And so
oh, amazing.
She's such a good example of it made me think about that because she's so well trained and she tries hard and does all the things, and we do all the periodization and all this stuff, but she has a couple injuries in her wrist that got flared up in the fall on that route, and so we had to do some more imaging and then progressed into training again. And she wasn't sure if she was going to go this spring, but she ended up going because she felt good. But she was very anxious about what to do while she was there, because she was there for a long time. But my advice to her was you don't need to do anything other than go try really hard when you feel good and then recover. And so we did a little bit of strength training, throughout the months that she was there, but it was really just a recovery thing. So I think one of the problems that people have with training for climbing is they get anxious about not doing enough or doing more stuff, right? But if you have this big training history like she does, and she's a very good climber, all she needs to do is recover really good. And then she needs to go try really hard and just try really hard. So that extra 5 to 10% effort is all she needed. But then she would just get closer and closer every week, where her confidence just grew. And then she was able to send her out. It was amazing because she's wanted that thing for a long time. And that's the first, what is it, 14A?
No, swing line's
13D. 13D.
Hard 13D. I think some would give it a 14A, but it's very, it's really a test piece 13D at the Red.
It was her first of that grade. She was just over the moon psyched. But it was very cool to and a good, testament of, when people do all the training things, they have all the things they need to send the route. They don't need more training things. They just need to work on their tactics, make sure their recovery is the most prioritized, go when the temperature's good, and then it's kind of a cool, that's the cool art side of climbing, I think, But in that context, she doesn't need more physical interventions, right? She just needs to go try hard. So I think that was what I was thinking there. After you like do these things, you put in all the work, fucking stop doing them and just go to your season and go, try hard.
Yes. I'm so excited. It's the summer right now, so I can't even, like, it seems so far away, but it'll creep up on me. And for those who are listening right now and thinking about their fall goals and their fall plans, maybe we work backwards. So let's say kind of October/November for those in the Northern Hemisphere. I guess in the Southern as well. They're the shoulder seasons, so it's spring or fall. If we're working backwards from that, you and I are talking it's June.
It's a long way away.
Is there a general understanding for kind of when, how to structure this out so that one feels their best in October?
I mean, right now you just want to get strong. Just people should be like, making their fingers strong, doing general weightlifting stuff, still climbing, primarily doing technical practice, power climbing, board climbing, not getting hurt on boards by doing really long sessions. Right? Like now everyone wants to go training mode, but they don't want to reduce the climbing volume that they're used to, but they want to add more training stuff in, which is a problem, right? Right now is the best time to pay attention to your power loss every session. Like if you're climbing on a board and you're, go warm up, have an hour-long session, you're climbing really good, doing some hard moves, then all of a sudden you can't do those hard moves, that's the end of the session. Like don't push it inside right now on a board because the slow build of tenosynovitis and pulley injuries and capsulitis won't present for another couple months. But that volume accumulation will kind of bite people in the ass. So now is a good time to end the session, make your session short, still focus on technical skills, do some weightlifting, finger strength, do some strength endurance training, gain some hypertrophy, in preparation for July. And then then you want to start getting, serious with like training target goals, but not for another, maybe even August, another couple months. That depends on the training athlete, though.
Sure. And then for, again, those, we just use me for an example. So, November is the best month typically at the Red. And so if the focus for a couple of months is like, let's get strong, still do like probably the one aerobic and one, power endurance session a week at least, maybe more power endurance as you and I have been talking about. But if we're talking about kind of July, August, being like, okay, we're really going to start ramping up now to try to peak in November. Does that look like those two power endurance sessions a week, one endurance, one peak kind of force, either like a kilter session or just like max hangs or something like that? Is that when that really kicks in earnest?
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay.
And then what maybe we should do is maybe we should chat again after your critical force test. Do this for like, 6 weeks and then be like, okay, cool, redo your critical force and see how it changed. That would be interesting for people to listen to of like, and then they could post your graph or we can be more, you can maybe get me that stuff before the pre-post graph and talk about training interventions and break it down. That would be interesting. People would be interested in that.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's cool. Okay, so then my homework between now and 6 weeks from now is to mainly focus on that 80% range as well as peak force. And then I'll retest. I'll send it to you. We'll have a follow-up conversation. And then I tested left hand, right hand. I'm assuming we're going to want to repeat the test, the same thing. I'm not going to switch to an overhead or
Try and do it the same way. And even if you were like below the body, pushing with your legs, do it the same. So you get the same. And that's the thing that people want to hear with like, what's the best method for doing it? We don't really know. Like I have opinions on what makes sense to me, but that's not validated either. And so it's like, if you do it a way, make sure you reproduce it in the same way with any sort of testing. And it's probably not wrong. They're just maybe measuring things slightly differently, but it's definitely not a wrong way to test it. So make sure it's the same.
Yeah. Okay, good. So I'll repeat the test and then we'll figure out kind of how that looks and then adjust the training protocol accordingly. Is it important to also train isolated right hand, left hand because my numbers were, 10 pounds different or something like that? Or can I just use like my tension flashboard and, kind of train both hands at once to save a little bit of time?
That's a good question. I would probably train them two arms at one time just to be faster, just from a practical standpoint. And that's why I do a lot of my critical force testing seated with the hips blocked, with the elbows at 90 degrees where they're intentionally curling with the fingers. I do that with the critical force test. Primarily because if you're going to be using a fingerboard as the intervention to target different components of the critical force, it's just fast. It's not fun. And so it's like, if I can make the not fun training thing as quick as possible, that's great, because there's going to be more compliance and the clients aren't going to hate doing it every time.
Right. Okay.
Because some people we all love training, but we all love training less than climbing. And so it's like the training is fun, but there's a point where you're like, I'm sick of doing the training.
All right, y'all, that wraps things up with Dr. Tyler Nelson, bringing the Dr. Tyler Nelson levels of science and analysis that I hope was really helpful for you. Obviously, it was really helpful for me because I was very much going down a path of just building the general endurance. And while that's incredibly important for me as a Red River Gorge climber who wants to be able to efficiently make moves forever and rest and recover en route, for my particular project, Flower Power, that Tyler and I talked about there, that's just like straight up power endurance. I mean, it's just going to be a lot of very hard moves for me in a row with not a whole lot of opportunity to recover. And so there's a lot that's going to go into that for me. I first and foremost just need to become a better climber. And so I'm going to be working with Nate Drolet, who's very familiar with the Red, but also has coached me on other things, to help me really expand my steep climbing toolkit. So I'm very excited about that. But then also I really need to get a lot more fit and also strong, per Tyler's analysis of my critical force test there, in order to put together what will be the hardest route I've ever tried on a rope. And that means putting a lot of emphasis now on power endurance, as Tyler has suggested. So here's what I'm doing. I'll tell you a little bit about what I'm doing, and also share with you how you can do something similar. I guess I'll share that now, because if you're listening to this right now and you're amped and you want to test your critical force, if you've got a force gauge like a force board or a tin deck, then those protocols are right in there. But if you don't, you can do this at home or at the gym using a hangboard and some pulleys to remove some weight, or some, weight plates and slings to add some weight, depending on, what you need to do based on your max hang. And we have created, with Tyler's help, a protocol in the Intentional Climber app to test your critical force. So there's a whole assessments suite of features in Intentional Climber. You go into the training hub and then you just click on assessments. And there you can test your max hang or edge lift, your base endurance, power endurance, and a whole bunch of other things are already in the assessments. And now we've got Dr. Tyler Nelson's critical force test in there, so you can run this heinous experiment on yourself. But look, just go into the pain cave for like whatever it is, 5 minutes, and the results, I think, could be incredibly enlightening to you. They certainly were for me. And by the way, Intentional Climber is an app that I helped to develop, and it's been in the works for over a year. We now have users in more than 30 countries, and there's a free 14-day trial. So if you just want to pop in there and test your critical force and check out, all the other features that are in the app, you can do that for free for 14 days. And if you don't want to continue, then just don't continue, and you don't get charged anything. And if you do want to continue, I have found it personally to be the absolute best way to stay accountable and motivated and reflective on all of this training and performing that I'm doing. There are coach plans in there. So Colin McGee, who works with C4HP, has a plan in there called Complete Climber. We've got Chris Hampton's Stronger Fingers program. So that's a free program, actually. If you use code STRUGGLE when you sign up, you get a free 6-week Stronger Fingers program. That will boost your MVC, which will, of course, improve your critical force altogether. So anyway, it's all right there. I wasn't intending this to turn into an ad for Intentional Climber, but there we have it. I just can't help myself. The point is, if you pop over to Intentional Climber, you can load up Dr. Tyler Nelson's critical force test and test yourself. And then once you have those results, hopefully based on this conversation here, you now have an idea of where to put your training focus. That'll give you a roadmap, if you will, to maybe just see how you might want to tweak some of your training. And how I'm tweaking my training right now, and especially as I'm about to head off to Australia, or I'm going to be there as you're listening to this, is I've added in a couple times a week these power endurance repeaters that Tyler and I talked about. So I'm using my force board. I've got just like a lifting edge. If I'm doing it with two hands, I'm going to use like the flashboard from Tension. But actually, when I'm traveling, it's easier to just travel with like one little grip thing. So I've got an edge from Specialized Masochism that I'm traveling with, and I'm just doing those 7-3 repeaters at about 80% of what my max is, and they're hard. I mean, 80% is a lot. You actually develop finger strength at 80%, but it's just kind of right on that threshold where it's a lot of power endurance. And I'm not looking at my results right now, but I'm doing 4 sets of those. I know Tyler said maybe up to 5, but right now I'm kind of easing in. So I'm doing 4 sets of those, and they drop off real fast. And the key is to, I'm not trying to game the test. So I just curl into it, and hit that 80% target line that I've got. Or if you're using a hangboard, you just have to be more intentional about kind of not resting on your connective tissue. Like just make it an active hang, if you will. And then as soon as I can't hit that mark, that ends that set. And it's not a lot. I mean, it's like 12 or something like that. I mean, the hope is to be able to get to like 30. And if I can get to 30 at 80%, then my power endurance might be approaching the point where I need it to be in order to do flower power and other really hard routes at the Red River Gorge. Can I make 30 moves in that power endurance zone, in that anaerobic zone, and then hopefully get to a rest and recover and be able to make some more moves? So that's what I'm working on. And it's very fast. It's a very fast workout, and it's super measurable, which I really like. That just kind of tickles like that type A part of my brain. And so I'm also doing power endurance climbing. I've been posting some videos of me recently at Rock Sport, and I'll talk more about this on the plog, which is going to come out soon. So I'm trying not to make this outro longer than it needs to be. But, power endurance climbing, which is linking together a lot of hard moves on routes, is a lot more fun than just doing these finger curls. But the finger curls are fast. I can do them at home, like in between conference calls or when the kids are getting ready for bed or whatever. And I can do them when I'm traveling, like right now. I'm also, because Tyler really reinforced with me the importance of keeping my max finger strength up and maybe even trying to improve on it, I'm keeping that in. I had kind of started to peel that back a bit after I sent Bulldog and just coming off of that like pretty intense year of boulder training. But clearly it's important to keep that MVC very high, which pulls up the whole critical force curve. So I'm doing a hard hangboard session a week just as part of a warm-up for a hard kilter session. So I'm just doing that once a week. But then these power endurance repeaters that I'm doing still also, like I mentioned, kind of hit that max strength. It's kind of like a good in-between. I saw Alex Magos posted a video not long ago of doing 7-3 repeaters that were like not max, but, near, it's kind of in that power endurance zone. I mean, he was doing them like one-handed on a like a little edge or whatever, but it's all relative. In any case, that it's a very efficient workout and kind of ticks a couple of boxes, which I really love as a busy climber. And I'd love to hear like how you're getting on with this. If you test your critical force in the Intentional Climber app or just otherwise, you can shoot me a message and let me know, like, what did you learn? What are your takeaways? And did I get any of this wrong? Tyler will probably reach out to me and let me know if I butchered any of this, but I think my understanding of it is clear, and I think my marching orders are clear. And so I'm very excited to add this in or feather some of this in while still working on the general endurance, kind of that zone 2 climbing that Eric Hurst wants me to do, and as does Nate. And then I'm working in quite a bit of drill work. So I'll talk more about that on the plog that's coming up here in a week or two, specifically like some of the drills that Nate has me doing and kind of how I'm structuring this, because I don't want to get injured. I just turned 47 and I feel awesome. I'm like definitely like in the best shape and the strongest I've ever been in my life, but also I'm, not able to recover as fast or bounce back from injuries as fast. And so I want to be thoughtful about how I'm incorporating some of these new training interventions. And I want to make sure that I am peaking in the fall so that I can actually go outside and have an amazing season on rock and not just like destroy myself for the next few months here in my basement. So that's the hope on all of that. I hope you're doing really, really good. Thank you for your support, by the way. I'm going to get back to my Australian adventure here, but I do love to hear from you. So shoot me a message on Patreon, on Instagram, or you can just email me. And I hope you're having a friggin' awesome day and a great summer. Let's get after it.